Hi, I'm Sarah Parker and I'm a lecturer in English at Loughborough University. In this short video, I'm going to talk about Charlotte Mew's poem, The Farmer's Bride. I'm going to focus particularly on the poem as a dramatic monologue, looking at the speaker and the listener and the way that Mew uses these to reveal the nature of the relationship between the farmer and his bride. So a dramatic monologue, as you may know, is a poem where the speaker is obviously someone other than the poet themselves. But it's worth saying that a poem's voice is always a kind of performance. So even when the speaker seems to have a close relationship to the poet themselves, the poem is always a kind of construction, a performance with the reader or the audience in mind. In the case of a dramatic monologue, though, the poem is often named after the person speaking, so a fictional or mythological character. So think of Ulysses by Tennyson, for example, or the poems in Carol Ann Duffy's collection, The World's Wife. So they're spoken by figures such as Medusa or Circe and named after those figures. We might then ask, why does Charlotte Mew adopt the farmer's voice and not that of his bride, if the poem is titled after her? So the poem's title relates to its wider theme of possession or possessive desire. The farmer speaks about his bride and we never actually hear her voice. The poem is dominated by his view of her. She does not get to tell her own story. She doesn't even have a name. She is just defined as his bride. And I think it's significant that it's not titled The Farmer's Wife. So why bride and not wife? This hints at her young age. So we're told early on in the poem that she may be too young, perhaps. And that also perhaps hints at the unconsummated nature of their marriage. So throughout the poem, she runs away and avoids getting close to the farmer. The only way that the farmer's bride communicates within the poem is through her eyes. So in the line, not near, her eyes beseech. So we have to read between the lines of what the farmer says about her in order to figure out how she feels about their relationship. If you think about it, dramatic monologues are often revealing about the psychology behind a relationship. And we can tell this even just judging from their titles alone. So think, for example, of Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, another poem in which a woman is described by a man. She can't give an account of herself, this Duchess, because she's dead, and the only way she's represented in the poem is by her silent painting that hangs upon the wall and that is described by the male speaker. Consider Browning's other poem, Porphyrias Lover. So in this poem, the speaker describes an encounter with his lover, Porphyria, but she herself never speaks aloud in the poem. The interesting thing about the title of Porphyrias Lover, of course, is that it positions him, the speaker, as her possession. So it's her lover, Porphyrias Lover. So this reverses those usual gender conventions on the titles of dramatic monologues. But towards the end of the poem, she moves from being the one in control. So early in the poem, she moves around, she's the one who's acting, and he just sits there, seemingly silent and passive. But towards the end of the poem, the power dynamics completely change suddenly and violently as when he murders her. So she then becomes the passive figure and he props her head up on his shoulder and tells us, the reader or listener, that she has had her utmost wish, as if she wanted to be murdered. But of course, there's no way of verifying this because she never herself gets to tell her story within the poem. So dramatic monologues seem to be a little bit obsessed with talkative men and silent women, and Charlotte Mew's The Farmer's Bride is no exception. Another perhaps more subtle feature of dramatic monologue that we need to think about is the role of the implied auditor or listener. So many critics describe dramatic monologues as overheard speech. So the implied listener of a dramatic monologue is important to think about because often what the speaker is saying and how they present themselves is shaped by a particular audience, which is either named explicitly in the poem or sometimes more subtly implied. So who is Mew's farmer actually speaking to? Well, the answer to that is a rather complicated one. It doesn't seem to be clear from looking at the poem itself. There is no clear listener or group of listeners named in the poem. Of course, on one level, we could simply say that the audience is us, the reader. The poem has a conversational tone that draws us in, as if we're standing in the room with the farmer as he talks at us about his bride. And as the poem goes on, we become increasingly uncomfortable with what we are hearing. If we read closely then, the poem contains lots of features of speech and accent. So I don't think this is just an inner monologue. I think this is supposed to be somehow capturing colloquial speech. So we've got contractions like more's to do and twasn't to woman, and grammatical idioms such as when us was wed. So all of this conjures the features of the farmer's distinctive speech, and it also suggests his social identity, so his regional accent, perhaps, his position as a member of the labouring classes. And we can tell that there is an implied listening audience also because he says things like too young maybe, and later the rhetorical question, what's Christmas time without there be some other in the house than we? So through these phrases, the farmer seems to appeal to a kind of collective wisdom or consensus, while also suggesting his urge to justify himself and the residual doubt about whether marrying this young girl was the right thing to do. So in saying things like this, it's as if he's saying, of course we should have children because we've got married. Everyone knows that, right? So there's a real sense that, that we're being appealed to indirectly to back up and justify what he's saying. And I think this is part of why the poem makes us feel very uncomfortable, increasingly uncomfortable as it goes on. As listeners and readers, we are implicated in the story of this young woman's unhappy, potentially abusive marriage. And we can't step into the poem and tell the farmer that what he is doing is wrong. We just have to silently listen to him as the poem goes on. And this generates an uncomfortable feeling that is actually enhanced by references to the community around the farmer in the poem. So there's the people who tell him where he can find his wife when she runs away. Out among the sheep her be, they said. And they also help him chase her down within the fields, like a classic angry mob. Even the women in the poem are described in collective terms, and they report on the bride's behaviour with the animals. So we're never actually told that the farmer's bride speaks to these women herself. So this implies that she doesn't trust them either. So she's really an isolated figure within this community, and we are being implicated into that wider community. So it seems that it's not just the farmer, but the whole society that is ranged against her, conspiring to catch her and to keep her trapped within this situation. And we as listeners and readers are assumed to be part of this too. The farmer seems to assume that we will agree with him, and this becomes most disturbing in the final part of the poem, the final stanza, when we seem to share his viewpoint very closely as he voyeuristically stares at the sleeping, vulnerable bride as she sleeps and describes the soft young down of her. So whether he has actually climbed the stairs and entered her bedroom, or whether this is just taking place in his fevered imagination, is kind of besides the point. By the end of the poem, we're brought uncomfortably close to his perspective, as if seeing through his eyes and sharing, whether we want to or not, his overwhelming possessive desire for her. We don't know for certain what he's actually doing at the end of the poem or what he's about to do, and the poem leaves us poised in this ambiguous moment with no resolution and nothing to make us feel at ease about what's about to happen or what has happened. And in this sense, the poem, I think, is an uncomfortable psychological portrait that's unsettling as Browning's Porphyrias Lover, for example, because the reader becomes a kind of accomplice simply through listening to the speaker and following their words to this unsettling conclusion. In my next video about the poem, I'm going to talk about how Mew uses form and metre in order to draw us along on this disturbing journey and to increase the psychological intensity of her dramatic monologue. But thank you for listening.